Hello and welcome. I'm Rachel Dwoskin, a novelist and a poet, and a member of the National Steering Committee of Writers for Democratic Action. I'm also the state chair of our Michigan committee, and it is an honor to work with my beloved colleagues at WDA. Thank you so much to Books and Books in Miami and its visionary owner, Mitchell Kaplan, to Christina Nosti and Sophie Perez for hosting us for today's Writers for Democratic Action Democracy Book Club with Robert Edwards and James Carroll. And thank you all so much for being with us. I'm going to say a few words about Writers for Democratic Action and then introduce James Carroll. James will introduce Robert Edwards and our conversation will be underway. We will leave time at the end for audience questions, so please feel free to put those in the chat at any time during the conversation. Writers for Democratic Action is a volunteer organization devoted to working for democracy globally, and especially in the US, where democracy and free reading are under attack. We were founded in 2020 by a small but fierce group of writers and have now grown to a robust international cohort of over 3,000 members and hundreds of bookstore partners, libraries, booksellers, and literary communities. We mobilize writers globally. Some of our recent speakers have included Margaret Atwood, Salman Rushdie, Natasha Trethewey, Jiayang Fan, Javier Zamora, contemporary poets from Ukraine, and scholars from Turkey, among others. We work to register voters, to connect citizens to bookstores and libraries, and to host conversations about democracy, literature, and hope, like this one today. Please join us as a member if you haven't already. All you have to do is sign your name at our website, writersfordemocraticaction.org, and check out our ongoing collaborative initiatives. James Carroll is one of our founding members, the beating heart of our organization. He is also the author of 12 novels and 9 works of nonfiction. For 23 years, he wrote a weekly op-ed column for the Boston Globe. He has received numerous awards, among them a National Book Award and a Scripps Howard Journalism Award. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His most recent book is The Truth at the Heart of the Lie: How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul. James, thank you for hosting our Democracy Book Club today. Over to you.
Rachel, dear friend, thank you so much for your welcome and introduction. I add my thanks to Sophie and to Mitch Kaplan, the paterfamilias of Books and Books, the most wonderful bookseller in America, who hosts us in this Democracy Book Club. And I want to also acknowledge all of you who are on this call this afternoon. Thank you for being with us. It's quite clear that we're all deeply committed to and concerned about the survival of democracy in the United States. And that's why it's a great privilege for me to introduce Robert Edwards and to be in conversation with him about his just now being published book, Resisting the Right: How to Survive the Gathering Storm. Bob, it's a special pleasure to be with you on this call today. How are you, my friend?
I'm great. Thank you, James. The pleasure is mine, and I'm so honored to be part of this this endeavor and part of WDA's efforts to defend democracy.
I've had the privilege of reading your book, Bob. In fact, I'm deeply privileged to have been invited by you to contribute a foreword to it, which I'm proud to have done. I'm really glad to be having this public discussion with you because of the practical wisdom you bring to the great and urgent question of how to protect, defend, make sure it survives democracy in America. I'm very struck by your subtitle, How to Survive the Gathering Storm. It's an image I associate with the gathering storm. Even this week, the Supreme Court, bump stocks, really? Last week, a surge of reactionary victories in the polls in Europe, the ongoing and astounding manifestation of pure nihilism in the Republican Party. And speaking of winds buffeting us, we're now on the cusp of this long summer and fall where America will be confronted with a true political hurricane. So how to survive the gathering storm, Bob? It's your image. What's the gathering storm that you're looking at? Start
Well,
for us, would you?
Yeah. I mean, you outlined several elements of it very well. Colin Robinson, my publisher at Or Books, and I chose that title very specifically to evoke Churchill and the threat of fascism in the 30s and the 40s. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think we're facing an unprecedented threat to democracy, not just in the United States, but globally. It's something that we have never reckoned with. Even in World War II, that was an external threat. We're talking about an internal threat, something that we're doing to ourselves. But I do want to say that I have two caveats to the subtitle. One is, storm is not a perfect metaphor, because a storm, weather, is something you cannot really do anything about except hunker down. And that is not the situation we're in. We are facing something that we can do something about. And that is what we're here to talk about today. The other caveat is survive is also a little bit off base, because I don't think we aim to just survive this. I think we aim to build back better, as somebody once said, and to come out of this with something closer to the democracy in the United States that thus far has been largely aspirational.
So you make the powerful point that the ideals of the founders of the United States of America made the immediate political and moral compromise, establishing structures of liberal democracy out of the great human turning point of the Enlightenment. And yet they immediately betrayed their own impulse by protecting, in the structures of the government they created, the institution of slavery, which is a contradiction that has never been resolved, even though it was profoundly confronted during the Civil War. You make that point too. So first, let's start with the structural problems facing our democracy that go right back to the founding American dilemma, how the Constitution itself, which is a kind of the sacred document, the kind of pillar of the American idea, how the Constitution itself carries the burden, the wound, you could say, of that compromise. And then you, in your book, lay out the institutional consequences of that compromise, having to do with everything from the Electoral College to the structure of the Senate to the ways in which the House of Representation is defined. The American dilemma, Bob, how does that haunt us right now in terms of what we're dealing with in this country?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head, and that is something that historians and observers have understood from the beginning, going back to Tocqueville. This country that was the first representative democracy that set this model for the whole world, incredibly inspirational, but also stained with this incredible contradiction, which had to do with slavery, and we're still dealing with it today. Obviously, the Civil War, as you say, is the most dramatic example of our reckoning with that, but we're still dealing with the after effects of that. And as you say, we see it in the institutions that were set up by the founding fathers. And whenever you talk about the founding fathers, somebody will always rise to say that we can't defy them. If we do such and such, it'll be, in opposition to what the founding fathers wanted. First of all, let's remember the world that those guys came from, and for all their brilliance and vision, many of them are slaveholders, and they came from a world that's completely alien to the one that we live in now. But more importantly, even they did not revere themselves the way that some people claim to revere them today, because they built a system that allowed for change. The Constitution is not written in stone. It's a living document, and they built into it methods for changing it and for adapting so that democracy could continue to adapt to changing conditions indefinitely. So in the book, I go into a lot of detail about those things, the specific policy prescriptions that are not new, but I tried to kind of compile them all in one spot. Everything from reforms to the Senate, very anti-democratic organization, the Senate, also a compromise based in slavery. Reforms of the Supreme Court, an expansion of the House, an end to the filibuster, an end to gerrymandering, changes to campaign finance laws, especially the overturning of Citizens United, and on and on and on. And those are specific structural changes. But there are smaller ones too, like ranked choice voting, getting rid of the debt ceiling, which has turned into nothing but an excuse for political terrorism, and all kinds of smaller things like that that can be done. They are not necessarily things we can do between now and November, but they are things that we should absolutely consider doing in the long term if we want this experiment in democracy to survive going forward.
So between now and November, everything you just said in terms of structural reforms depends on the political mechanisms that depend in turn on voting.
Right.
And one of the problems immediately in front of us is the way in which voting rights, the structures of voting itself, have been undermined and attacked by Republicans in a very kind of blatant way. How are you thinking about this aspect of the dilemma? Every institutional reform that you advocate depends on voting.
Right.
And the individual citizens' access to the ballot, access to the polling place in peace, the support of the process of voting, a reliable system of voting being counted, voting being reported in ways that are not able to be contradicted. The crisis of voting, Bob, where are we with that? How do you think about what's ahead of us immediately now?
Well, that is the most fundamental threat to democracy that I think we're facing, and it's the thing that made me really want to write the book, because we can disagree about almost everything else as a people. Individually, we can disagree, and as groups and parties, we can disagree about abortion, we can disagree about gun control, we can disagree about anything you want. But once a commitment to free and fair elections is taken out of the system or compromised, then all bets are off. And to me, that was the most alarming thing about what happened in 2020 and on January 6, 2021, and has continued since then, is this methodical attempt to undermine the integrity of the electoral system in the United States. The big lie that Trump won, the whole idea that your vote doesn't matter, that your vote isn't properly counted, that there's some kind of server in Italy or Jewish space lasers or whatever the hell it is. But this entire endeavor to undermine the integrity of the electoral system in the United States is the most threatening piece of the anti-democratic project. So voter suppression goes way back. I don't need to tell anybody here that. And the Republican Party has been engaged in that for a very long time. It's particularly acute now when demographics are trending against them. I mean, the Republicans have only won the popular vote in one presidential election out of the last 8, if I'm counting right. So they know very well that they are going to have trouble winning free and fair elections. So it's no surprise that they've turned to saying, well, the elections are not free and fair. So there have been a great many efforts in Congress, for example, to shore up voter protections, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and For the People Act, and many other endeavors. They've all been killed by Republican filibusters. So you have to ask yourself, when a party is openly opposed to truly free and fair elections, what does that tell you about them?
You cite a scholar named, is it Tim Heaphy? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, Tim Heaphy? I'm not sure I know. He's actually an attorney. He's a lawyer.
Attorney. Well, I want to cite what you say in his voice, that the real divide in the United States is not between red states and blue states. It's between those who still affirm the social contract and those who have abandoned it. The Republican Party seems quite blatantly to have abandoned the social contract in ways that are unprecedented. Where does that leave us, for example, when we're trying to maintain the commitment to the legitimacy of both parties, the American idea, for example, the idea of bipartisanship or nonpartisanship? We're committed to the country first, to our party second. What happens when one of the parties has officially, fully, and quite clearly abandoned its commitment to the Commonwealth itself. Then what? How do we proceed given that?
It leaves us in a bad spot because we're a two-party system. I mean, let's not talk about third parties and third-party candidates. It's either going to be a Democrat or a Republican that's going to win the presidency for the foreseeable future. And as you say, when one of those parties openly abandons its commitment to participatory democracy, we've got a problem. And it brings me no joy to say that because I come from a moderate conservative family, Republican family. I used to be a registered Republican. I spent my formative years in the military, very conservative world. That party that I grew up with is no more. The current Republican Party is unrecognizable. Ronald Reagan would be thrown out of it. Nixon would be thrown out of it. John McCain damn near was thrown out of it. So the party that we're now dealing with is openly anti-democratic. It doesn't even try to hide it. And that is the heart of the problem. And you cannot, this gets into a separate area about how the media is covering the election, but this is not like elections of old where you've got two good faith players. Each of them has a cogent platform that you may or may not agree with, but you can at least have a reasonable, an argument based in rationality about those issues. That's not the case here. We're talking about one party that's committed to participatory democracy and the other one that has openly announced that it will throw that out the window. And that, to me, is the message that we as concerned citizens and responsible members of the media should be drumming into the voters' heads every day between now and November.
Well, that gets to a basic point. We just touched on the institutional and structural difficulties that are blowing wind against the democratic idea. And now we're talking about a very particular collapse of the American political structure that is really blowing wind against the idea of democracy, all of which leads to what you refer to in your book at one point as the great, almost conspiratorial lie of the right wing, which is that the coming election will inevitably be a defeat for those who are trying to protect democracy. Trump's election is inevitable. The chokehold of the reactionaries on our democracy is unbreakable. What do you say to people for whom that sense is growing, a sense of discouragement that may even be underwriting people's impulse to leave politics behind? How inevitable is it? What do you say to that?
Well, the first thing I say is don't believe the hype, in the words of Public Enemy. That is psychological warfare 101. They want you to believe that. They want you to believe it's over, that Trump's victory is inevitable, that it's a fait accompli, and they're playing on the PTSD that we all have after going on 8 years now of this. I mean, everyone's exhausted. And the far right, which is now in control of the Republican Party, would very much like us to throw up our hands and say, well, he's going to win. What can you do about it? I hear it a lot. I hear it even from friends of mine on the left, people who are left of me even. They're beaten down, and that is exactly what the Republican Party would like to play on. But I'm here to tell you it is not the case. Polls are notoriously unreliable. I'm not going down the 2016 road of saying don't believe them. There's a lot of reason to be concerned. It's appalling that this race is as close as it is, considering the two candidates and what one of them, the convicted felon one, has done. But it is close, and it's close enough that we can win it. We can absolutely win it, and it's largely a matter of that perception that you were talking about before. First, let's get past the perception that the race is over and Trump's going to win. That is by no means the case. Then let's take control of the narrative and make sure that everybody we know, our friends and our family and everybody we talk to, is well aware of what's at stake and what the real facts are. I know you can't reason with people who are too drunk on the Kool-Aid. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about people who are persuadable, people who want to vote for Joe Biden but may feel like, what's the use, right? Those people have to be brought back into the fold. And then there's also a very small but still significant kind of sliver of folks in the middle who could go either way. But they're not going to go our way if they think it's a done deal.
Well, let's stay for a moment with the fatalism and think together about what resisting the right means if in November Trump does win, if in November the worst happens in the other elections, the Senate, the House. What does resisting the right mean after an election that goes wrong? And I asked that question aware of wanting to directly confront the fatalism that I sense in myself and friends that, oh, well, if we lose the election, it's all over. I'm too old to move to another country. But we hear people half joking, but not only joking, talking about abandoning the project of the United States. Right. Your book is very clear that that's not where you are. How do you imagine resisting the right if the right takes full control of the levers of government?
Well, I understand that my book is a little bit of a paradox in that I just got on my soapbox about how we can't give up. And yet the book looks ahead to what do we do in the event of a worst case scenario. So it surveys the current state of affairs, what we can do in the meantime. And then the second part of the book talks about that. What do we do if the worst befalls us, or nearly the worst, and we fall under the heel of a far right wing autocracy? And there's a lot that we can do. First of all, I know plenty of people who say that too, not only half joking, well, I'm going to leave. And I get it. But lots of people can't leave. Most Americans do not have the resources to say, I'm going to move to Portugal, right? So let's not abandon our countrymen. And there's much that can be done. And you actually, of all people, Jim, know much better than I do, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many models for how to resist far more brutal autocracies than we're looking at in the short term. Closest to home, the civil rights movement, of which you were an integral part, is a perfect model for how nonviolent, principled resistance to an autocratic regime can function. Because as I say in the book, this is quoting Tim Snyder of Yale, most authority or most obedience is freely given, right? Autocrats don't have to take it. They don't have to put police in the streets. People simply accept their authority, and we don't have to do that. Not just Tim Snyder said that. Gene Sharp, Jonathan Schell, all the great scholars of nonviolent resistance agree on that point. Power comes from the people, and we can withhold it, and there's lots of practical ways we can do that. The first that comes to mind, of course, is protest. But as you told me, and it's in the book, protest is limited in its efficacy. And a step beyond that is active civil disobedience, boycotts, economic levers, strikes. Unions are crucial to this effort. General strikes. I mean, it gets into tax revolts. The blue states in this country contribute about 70% of the GDP. For them to withhold their revenues from the federal government would be a dramatic, tectonic effort on their part, but it's not beyond the pale, because we don't know how bad this autocracy is going to be. But I think it's going to be pretty bad based on what they're openly telling us that they're going to do. And there are many smaller things. As long as some sort of democracy continues to function, there's ballot initiatives. Ballot initiatives have been very effective over the past few years in protecting, for example, abortion rights. Every time it's been on the ballot, it has won. And an anti-abortion forced birth ballot initiative has never won. There are things like that. There's the media is a huge part of it. Public health is part of it, because thanks to COVID, and even before COVID with the firearms epidemic, public health has become a front in the political fight. Education is a front in the political fight. So all these are things, all these are levers that are within our control, where we can exert asymmetrical pushback against an autocracy.
So let's stay with that for a moment and take former President Trump at his word when he describes rounding up thousands of immigrants, however defined, to deport them. And he's actually talked about camps. He's actually talked about what have to be called concentration camps in some horrible way. How do you imagine the citizens of the United States would respond to such a turn in the story?
That is a good question, because I don't know how they would respond. We talk about American exceptionalism. I'm very proud to be an American, but I don't know that the people of the United States are any wiser or more humane than the people of many other countries that have fallen under the heel of autocracy and have allowed terrible things like that to go on. So I would hope that if Donald Trump were to somehow manage to get a second term and deployed law enforcement, or God forbid the US military, to round up something like 11 million immigrants and try to forcibly deport them or put them in camps, that we would not stand for it, that we would get out in the streets and physically prevent that from happening. The sanctuary city movement is a sort of forerunner to that. There are things that can be done that the state is not capable of overcoming except by force. And I don't for a second think that they will not resort to force. I mean, you saw what happened in Lafayette Square, saw what happened on January 6th. But that, getting back to the question about the narrative and perception, the image of the federal government deploying force against peaceful protesters is not a winning look for them.
You make a wonderful look back at some of the ways in which resistance has unfolded in the past. And it's interesting how practical and down to earth some of the examples you lift up are. For example, you talk about comedy. You lift up comedians who have been prophetic in their critique of power. You remind us about the Smothers Brothers, who effectively introduced a whole new kind of language, rejecting and objecting to the war in Vietnam. You remind us about Tina Fey and her impersonations of, I'm blanking on her name.
Oh, Sarah Palin.
Sarah Palin, thank you. You remind us about the place of religion as a source of powerful resistance, the civil rights movement driven by resisting religion, the peace movement having powerful elements of religious resistance, institutions of education, history teachers, teachers of literature, on the front line of defending democracy simply by defending the ability of people to read and to know the truth of what's happened in the past. Educators, and then, of course, journalists. Say something about journalism. You're both a powerful critic of the way in which journalism is playing its role in this crisis, but you also lift up the possible sources of citizen power that journalism can represent. Give us your take on that.
If I may touch on the arts for a second before I move on to journalism, the point about my wife and I spent almost 20 years making a documentary about comedy and taboos, and a piece of that was the lack of power of satire. And so in the book, I do talk about some of those examples, the Smothers Brothers and so forth. And I think that's another front, but I'm reminded of the British comedian Peter Cook, who said, look what the cabarets of Weimar did to stop Hitler. So I would caution about putting too much faith in satire or comedy, because very often it's used to make ourselves feel good and superior. And what it doesn't do, people who are at home laughing at jokes on late night TV about Trump's hair are not people who are out on the street organizing. So I love comedy, and I think it has a place, but I think we have to be aware of its limits. To your question about journalism, I mean, it circles back to what we were talking about before. Control in the narrative, perception is everything in any conflict, and the media is at the center of that. We still, even now, after 8 years of this unprecedented political earthquake, we still have a mainstream media that is operating in the old pre-Trump paradigm, which is a kind of slavish obedience to some idea of objectivity, both sidesism. I mean, there was a story on a radio network that shall remain nameless, but is famously said to be left of center. I listened to it just this week. They were reporting on the attempt to hold Merrick Garland in contempt. He was held in contempt, in fact. And they treated it as if it was a perfectly reasonable political maneuver. And here's the points on this side, and here's the points on that side. There was no mention, not even one mention of fact that the people on that House Oversight Committee included Gosar and Biggs and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan, people who are at the center of the big lie and are not interested in good faith politics or anything at all except blowing up the system. So my point is the media, and this is like a broken record because a lot smarter people than me have been saying this for years. The media has to break out of that old paradigm, recognize the crisis that we're in, and change the way that it reports. I'm not saying it takes sides, but I'm saying that it has a responsibility to remind the American public, as part of its remit, what is going on and what each side stands for, and not resort to the old-fashioned horse race mentality, which sells papers and drives ratings and is great for them, for the press, but is not a public service.
Can you give us an example of journalism that has done that in the past?
Yeah, in the book, there's a few good examples. For example, there was a rally when J.D. Vance was running for the Senate in Ohio, and the rules that the organizers of the rally, the restrictions that it put on the press were really draconian. And so I think it was the Cleveland Plain Dealer refused to abide by those rules. And instead of reporting on the rally, it ran like 6 column inches of white space on its front page. There's another example in the book. I think it comes from Margaret Sullivan. I can't remember if it was when she was at the Post or the Times, but about a public radio station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that in all its stories, no matter what the topic of the story was, it informed the listeners the position of the politicians in question when it came to the legitimacy of Biden's victory. So if it was an argument about gun control or whatever, and they cited some Republican legislator, they would contextualize it in terms of that person's other beliefs. So these are little things, but they go against the grain that journalists have been taught and the ethos they've been inculcated with. But it does not require an abandonment of its duty that journalists are charged with. I would argue that it's a fulfillment of that duty.
I want to just address our members of our community out there that will welcome any questions you have for Bob. If you want to put them in the chat now, I'll turn to them in a few minutes. Bob, shifting gears slightly, you are a distinguished filmmaker.
I'm a filmmaker.
Yes, you've written powerful screenplays. You've written and directed several really important movies. The intersection of politics and Hollywood is one of the great American stories. It's a mixed story. You talk in the book powerfully about who controls the information space.
Right.
And the filmmaking world, television, streaming, old-fashioned movies, do more in and for and about and to the information space than almost any other medium. Step back a bit from the conversation we're having about resisting the right and talk to us as a man who's immersed in the world of making movies. And how does the movie making enterprise either impede the defense of democracy or advance it?
I don't want to generalize, because when you talk about Hollywood as a metonym like Wall Street or the Pentagon or whatever, it's made up of a lot of diverse elements. But I do think that the notion that Hollywood leans left is a joke. And having worked in that industry for 20 some years, I can tell you firsthand it's a joke. There's plenty of conservatives in Hollywood. But more to the point, the entertainment industry in the United States is largely apolitical. It's driven by commerce. That's not surprising or even, damning. That's just what it does. And so when it comes to corporate-owned media, they're not going to do anything to rock the boat unless there's money to be made. And usually there's money to be made by not rocking the boat. So they might accidentally rock the boat if the moment is right. Something might slip through that's very powerful, and we've all seen films like that. If you're talking about the motion picture industry, But by and large, it's apolitical, and it will go with the prevailing winds. And so I'm not counting on Hollywood to save us at all. I mean, we could talk about individual people and actors and filmmakers and musicians and athletes, all kinds of, just like any other citizen, they're all entitled to their opinion. And it's very interesting who gets slapped down for their opinion. You know, if you're Harrison Butker, you get applauded by the right wing for your commencement speech. If you're Colin Kaepernick, you get blackballed. So the opinions of individual people in the entertainment industry are kind of separate from the corporate imperatives of the entertainment industry. And so I don't think that Hollywood in particular is a place we should look to for salvation.
Well, you talk in your book about the importance of knowing what the story is. Again, stepping back from the particulars we're discussing now, I'd like to ask you to think a little more abstractly for a minute. What's going on with this country? What's going on with us as a people? Why are we in this place? What do you make of it? You think of Donald Trump less as the crime than as the evidence. What's he the evidence of? What's the Republican embrace of nihilism the evidence of? What's happening to us as a people?
I think your choice of nihilism is very apt, and I've written about that a bit. Yes, it's become trite to say, but still true. Trump is not the source of the illness; he's a symptom, right? One of the things that offends me most about him, and always has, is he's so unsubstantial. Vladimir Putin is a proper villain. He was a KGB lieutenant colonel. Trump was a D-list game show host and celebrity wannabe. So in that regard, he's a perfect tyrant for the United States. But he's a vessel. He's a vessel for this incredible grievance. I mean, this grievance that I personally, and I think that a lot of other people, didn't realize ran so deep and so wide. And so that's why an appeal to reason has been almost useless in trying to reach the hardcore MAGA, because the very things that we think are damning about Trump and his movement, they love. I thought Trump was done when he attacked McCain way back in, was it 2015 or 2016? I thought, well, that was entertaining. He's through. I couldn't have been more wrong. And that has repeated over and over and over again. So when Trump gets indicted, his numbers go up. He fundraises off it. People love it. When he says things that are appalling to many of us, many other people love it. And I don't pretend to understand it. I mean, I can't answer your question. A lot smarter people than me have tried to answer that. But it seems to me that he is a vessel for this great bubbling grievance that's tied up in all kinds of historical threads in this country going back to its founding. And we're at a moment of reckoning with those forces. And come November, we'll find out how it shakes out.
What does it mean to you that there are versions of this story unfolding in Europe?
Well, Anne Applebaum had a great piece in The Atlantic this week about that. And she made the point that the so-called populists, I don't like that term, but the far-right movements in Europe are actually a lot more discreet than Trumpism, right? So Wilders in the Netherlands and Le Pen in France and Meloni in Italy, they're kind of camouflaging their authoritarianism, right? Tacking to the center in the traditional way to win elections. That is not happening in the United States. In the United States, you've got a candidate saying openly he'll be a dictator, but only for one day. So in some ways, I think the United States is in a worse position than those allies of ours. But of course, it's all connected. You know, Trump's affinity and fondness for dictators, from Duterte to Putin to Erdogan to Orban and all the rest, is well known, and it's really terrifying. The implications for NATO in a second Trump administration are awful. I guess the grievance is not restricted to the United States. A version of it is in play all over the world, and it always has been, right? Maybe going back to the dawn of time, it comes and goes, but right now it's coming, and it's at high tide And that is the thing that is most scary.
You started our conversation by saying that you wanted to go beyond survival. You wanted to build back better. Let's suppose this is a moment of hitting bottom, that the American political system is hitting its negative bottom now. And the flaws that are dragging us down are being laid bare. And because they're being laid bare, we're capable of seeing something new about our country, and it enables us to recover something. How would that play out in your view?
That is exactly my hope, and you said it very eloquently. Hitting rock bottom or near rock bottom, or being forced to confront these ugly factors and the problems that we have, and not simply flattering ourselves that we're a city on the hill and all that, is essential. And maybe this is a moment when we can do that. Maybe that's the silver lining here, that we're forced to confront these flaws in our system and in ourselves. And if we survive and don't find ourselves saddled with an authoritarian regime come January, we can take some of the steps I talked about earlier, the systemic changes to shore up our democracy. We wouldn't be in this problem if we didn't have an anti-democratic system like the Electoral College. So there are things that we can do. But to your broader point about thinking abstractly, this is a moment when the people of the United States really have to think long and hard about who we are as a people, whether that exceptionalism is just bullshit, or whether we really are going to live up to the principles that we claim to revere.
Here's a question from Oskald Melnicek. But would these grievances have legs without the support of billionaires, including many in Silicon Valley? What kind of economic reforms might be needed?
Right. That's a fantastic question, and it's absolutely true. There's a whole chapter, a couple of chapters, in fact, in the book about the economic underpinnings of autocracy. And economic inequality is autocracy's handmaiden. So the economic inequality we have in the United States right now, with this outrageous billionaire class and the unprecedented influence they have, the volume of their voice in our politics, particularly since Citizens United in 2010, is a huge issue. And not to excuse it, but some of the grievance I was talking about before economically is legitimate, because we've been sold this Horatio Alger myth our whole lives. Now, there's a lot of research that suggests that economics is not the main driving factor in Trump's supporters, but we'll set that aside for a minute. I've been working on a film for the last 5 years with my good friend Justin Shine called Death and Taxes, which is about that exact issue, economic inequality. And until we address that, all the other things that we do are going to continue to be a problem, because in the same way that democracy depends on a fair one person, one vote system, it also depends on equity among the voices that are in that democracy. And when you've got the uber wealthy who are able to control, I mean, look at the Supreme Court. I don't have a private jet I can fly Alito or Thomas around on. And if I did, maybe I would get more attention there.
Well, you make a reference to this film work you're doing right now that has relevance to this question. And here's a question from Rachel Dwoskin. Are poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, or visual art possible venues for actual and nuanced resistance? And if so, how? Do you have any favorite instances of art working to shift the narrative or make change?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, absolutely. Even though I was denigrating satire and comedy a little while ago, I don't mean to say that there's no place for the arts in the so-called resistance. There's a huge place. I mean, some of the greatest works of art, particularly in fiction and theater and music, have come out of instances of oppression. The entire Western pop music tradition would not exist without the blues, right? I don't want to cite any examples and leave anybody out, but I'll cite Death and the Maiden, the Ariel Dorfman play, as a fantastic example of a work of art that speaks very powerfully about the consequences of tyranny, and that's just one of many. So I would encourage anybody out there who's an artist to continue doing what they're doing, because that's one thing they have trouble stopping you from doing, right? They have trouble stopping people from writing songs and from scrawling graffiti on the walls and painting and even making films.
Say another word about your own work, your documentary, for example, about comedy and the horrors of political oppression.
Yeah, it was actually my wife Fern Perlstein who had been trying to make that film since before I met her, and we've been together 25 years now. She was very, very passionate about exploring that issue of how humor and comedy could be used in a constructive way, even in the most horrible situations, and taking the Holocaust as the ultimate example. We worked on that film for about 20 years, and the star of it was a woman who's now, I'm going to get her age wrong, I believe she's 99, named Renee Firestone, who's an Auschwitz survivor. It's not to say you can make fun of horrors and tragedies, but it is to say that humor is a means of resistance, survival, counterattack, and it's an integral part of the human condition. And when you lose that, you risk losing your humanity along with it.
And here's a question that invites us to get back to the very practical business of getting ready for November. This is from Sean Scully.
I know Sean Scally very well. He's a very good old friend of mine.
Well, here's his question to you, Bob. How do you get legislators to change things like term limits, gerrymandering, and other what are now institutional norms? How do we get a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate in addition to a Democrat in the White House?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. How do you get the people who control the levers of power to give up some of those levers when they benefit them? Very hard to do for obvious reasons. And I don't think it's something that can be done overnight, but I do think that it definitely cannot be done if the people don't make their voice heard. If a critical mass of the American people stand up and demand common sense reforms to whether it's term limits, whether it's changes at campaign finance laws, whether it's ranked choice voting, whatever it is, we can make our voice heard and put pressure on those legislators of both parties until they have to respond or vote the bastards out.
We're almost at the time when we have to adjourn, Bob. I want to conclude with a note of my own about your book, but do you want to offer any parting thoughts you have for the folks who've gathered with us on how to resist the right and how to survive the gathering storm?
Well, I'll go back to the talked about the subtitle. I'll go back to the title of the book for a minute. There was a very powerful essay published by Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow. She published it in the New York Times early on in the Trump administration, and it was called "We Are Not the Resistance." So even though the book is called "Resisting the Right," really the metaphor is backwards, right? As she says, we are not the resistance. We are the mighty river they are trying to dam, right? The human impulses for freedom and democracy and justice, and that flows throughout all of humanity. And it's these guys, the autocrats, who are the ones who are pushing against that. So we're going to go beyond resistance, and we're going to try to create that true democracy that I was alluding to earlier, that is a much bigger endeavor than just beating Donald Trump.
Well, here's how you put it at the end of your book. Ultimately, we are not just trying to stave off an autocracy or resist it should it arise. We're trying to build a true democracy in a form that our country has never fully been able to mount. Naively or otherwise, you say, I believe All of that is within our capability as a people. It's in our hands. I want to encourage everyone who's on this call to pay attention to Bob's blog. It's called The King's Necktie. Bob shows up with it every week or two with a powerful set of reflections, just of the sort we've been hearing today. The King's Necktie, Robert Edwards. The book we've been reflecting on, Resisting the Right, How to Survive the Gathering Storm. It's just now being published. You'll see at the bottom of your screen the green square. Well, it's an oblong. It says, buy the book here. And thanks for watching. Bob, I want to thank you for the privilege of this conversation. I also want to thank you for the privilege of your asking me to contribute a word of appreciation for the book. I really wish you well with this book. I think it's coming at exactly the right moment, and I think it will be a source of powerful affirmation of the democratic project in this crucial moment.
Well, Jim, thank you very much, but the privilege is all mine. And this effort that we're engaged in now is only due to the efforts of your generation and people like you. And so it's your shoulders we're standing on.
Thank you for that, Bob. My friends, I want to offer one final thought in conclusion, and it comes from the Writers for Democratic Action. I want to invite you to pay attention to a project of ours that will be coming to its climax on July 19th. It's called It Can't Happen Here Again. Bob began our conversation today by referring to the 1930s, the Churchill analogy to the gathering storm. On October 27, 1936, Sinclair Lewis premiered a play called It Can't Happen Here, based on his novel. And it was done simultaneously on 21 stages in 17 different states across this country, 1 week before that year's critical election, 1936. Writers for Democratic Action is mounting It Can't Happen Here again on July 19th this summer, the day after Donald Trump presumably will accept the Republican nomination for president. Please go to our website and join us on July 19th for our rendition, our simple, easily produced rendition of It Can't Happen Here again. Go to writersfordemocraticAction.org/ICHH and please join us in this firm act of resistance to the gathering storm. Once again, Bob Edwards, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And to all of you who've gathered with us today, well, we're a gathering storm too, aren't we?
Right
Thank you for being with us.